The UFC has built its global reputation on one simple promise. Nothing is fake, nothing is hidden, and nothing is softened for the audience. Every punch, every scream, every drop of blood is shown exactly as it happens. That raw honesty is why millions of fans fell in love with MMA in the first place. But over the years, that same commitment to showing everything has created moments that went far beyond excitement. Moments that made entire arenas fall silent. Moments that left commentators searching for words. Moments where even longtime fans instinctively looked away from the screen. This video isn't about questioning the legitimacy of the sport. It's about recognizing the thin line between competition and spectacle, between documenting a fight and broadcasting something that should never have been replayed. Because once a camera captures something live, it doesn't just record history, it decides what the world remembers. A single second can follow a fighter for the rest of their life. A moment that should have disappeared can instead become one of the most replayed clips in UFC history. From catastrophic injuries shown in slow motion, to post-fight chaos that hijacked the biggest events, to moments of pure public humiliation that stripped fighters of their dignity. The UFC has aired scenes that crossed the line from shocking into deeply uncomfortable. Some were accidents. Some were driven by emotion. Others were preventable failures that slipped through because the show simply could not stop. Tonight, we're breaking down the UFC moments that arguably should have been censored. Not to sensationalize them again, but to understand what happens when a sport built on absolute realism refuses to look away. Because sometimes, the most disturbing part isn't what happens inside the octagon. It's the fact that the cameras never stop rolling. Most fighters leave the octagon with bruises, cuts, maybe a black eye, injuries that heal with time and fade into memory. Tim Sylvia walked away with something completely different. At UFC 48 inches June 2004, Sylvia stepped into the cage to face Frank Mir for the vacant UFC heavyweight championship, carrying an 18-0 record and the image of an unstoppable giant. The fight was expected to be competitive, possibly even long. Instead, it lasted just 50 seconds and produced one of the most disturbing images ever broadcast in UFC history. Sylvia's game plan should have been obvious. Stay standing, use his reach advantage, and avoid Mir's elite Brazilian jiu-jitsu. But in a decision that baffled commentators and fans alike, Sylvia took Mir down voluntarily, walking directly into the one place he never should have been. Within seconds, Mir locked in a tight armbar, isolating Sylvia's right arm. As Mir applied pressure, something went catastrophically wrong. Sylvia's forearm visibly snapped under the skin, bending at an angle that arms are never meant to bend. There was no ambiguity, no slow realization. The break was immediate, violent, and impossible to ignore. Referee Herb Dean stopped the fight instantly, but Sylvia didn't understand why. He jumped up, waved his arm, protested the stoppage, clearly believing the referee had made a mistake. The crowd booed, assuming the fight had been ended too early. Then the replay appeared on the big screen. The arena fell completely silent. In slow motion, millions of viewers watched the radius and ulna fracture, the arm buckling unnaturally as the submission tightened. X-rays later confirmed 4 fractures in Sylvia's forearm. He underwent surgery days later, requiring a titanium plate and multiple screws to stabilize the damage. For many fans, the injury itself was horrifying. But the story didn't end there. 16 years later, in 2020, Sylvia posted photos showing the long-term consequences. The screws from the original surgery had begun pushing through his skin, causing infection and severe pain. He needed another operation, one that would cost over $10,000. Sylvia reached out to the UFC, hoping the organization would help cover the medical costs for an injury that happened live on pay-per-view, watched by millions. The response was blunt. The UFC refused, stating that his injury was no longer their responsibility. Without insurance, Sylvia's fiancé started a GoFundMe campaign. Fans donated enough to cover the surgery, effectively paying for the aftermath of an injury that the UFC had replayed countless times to promote future fights. What made the situation even more uncomfortable was Sylvia's past. 9 months before the Mir fight, he had been stripped of his title after testing positive for stanozolol, a banned steroid. He admitted to using it to cut weight, accepted a 6-month suspension, and paid a $10,000 fine. Whether that history influenced the UFC's decision not to help remains unanswered. What's undeniable is this: Silvia's broken arm became a marketing tool. The footage was replayed over and over, used to highlight Frank Mir's submission skills, used to shock casual fans, used to remind viewers how brutal MMA can be. The snap, the disbelief, the replay, the long-term damage. It all combined into a moment that defined Silvia's career far more than his championship reign ever did. And while it's remembered as a landmark UFC highlight, it remains one of the clearest examples of a moment that probably should have never been shown at all. If Tim Silvia's broken arm showed the physical limits of the human body, then UFC 229 exposed something far more volatile. What happens when hatred leaves the cage? On the 6th of October 2018, the UFC staged the biggest pay-per-view event in its history. Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Conor McGregor wasn't just a title fight. It was a collision of cultures, egos, religions, and months of unchecked provocation. The tension wasn't manufactured. It was real, and everyone felt it long before the fighters touched gloves. The build-up to the fight had already crossed lines. In April 2018, McGregor attacked a bus at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, smashing windows with a steel hand truck, while Khabib and other fighters were inside. Several athletes were injured by flying glass, fights were canceled, and McGregor was arrested and charged. Instead of distancing itself, the UFC used the footage as promotional material, turning real violence into hype. From that moment on, the fight was no longer just about a belt. Inside the cage, the fight itself was decisive. Khabib dominated McGregor, controlling him on the ground, breaking him down round by round, and finally submitting him with a rear-naked choke in the 4th round. The contest was over. The belt was won, and then everything fell apart. Instead of celebrating, Khabib stood up, stared into McGregor's corner, pointed, screamed, and made a decision that changed the night forever. He threw his mouthpiece, climbed the fence, and leapt into the crowd, attacking Dylan Danis, McGregor's teammate. At the same time, chaos erupted inside the cage. 2 members of Khabib's team stormed the octagon and attacked McGregor while he was still sitting on the canvas, exhausted from the choke. One struck him from the front. Another came from behind, landing multiple punches before security intervened. Drinks were thrown. Fans screamed. Police flooded the arena. Cameras captured everything in real time. This wasn't a scuffle hidden backstage. This was a full-scale riot broadcast live to millions. UFC President Dana White later called it the most disappointing moment of his entire tenure. The Nevada State Athletic Commission immediately stepped in. Khabib's purse was withheld. His team members were detained, and the possibility of him being stripped of the title was openly discussed. White refused to place the championship belt around Khabib's waist inside the arena, fearing that the pro-Conor crowd might riot. The champion walked out without the visual that defines every title win. When Khabib finally spoke, his explanation revealed how deep the damage ran. He said McGregor had insulted his religion, his family, and his country, and that those things were not part of fight promotion. He admitted losing control, but defended the emotion behind it. The Nevada Athletic Commission eventually issued penalties. Khabib was suspended for 9 months and fined $500,000, while McGregor received a 6-month suspension and a $50,000 fine. The imbalance itself became another controversy. Years later, fans still debate whether the cameras should have cut away. The brawl overshadowed everything: the technical mastery of Khabib, the submission, the title defense. Instead, the lasting image of UFC 229 is not a fight, but a cage jump, fists flying, and a sport momentarily losing control of itself. It was raw, it was real, and it was arguably a moment that should have been censored, not because it didn't happen, but because broadcasting it transformed a championship into chaos. Not every UFC moment that should have been censored is violent. Some are far worse because they strip a fighter of dignity, not health. On the 3rd of October 2015, at a Ruckus in the Cage event in West Virginia, heavyweight Travis Wolford learned that live combat sports offer no mercy when something goes wrong. What happened that night wasn't a brutal knockout or a broken bone. It was an accident so humiliating that it permanently defined his name online. Wolford was facing Daniel Cooper in a heavyweight bout. Early in the fight, Cooper secured top position and began working toward a submission. As Wolford struggled underneath, Cooper locked in a tight guillotine choke. The pressure was immediate. And then, without warning, Wolford lost complete control of his body. As he tapped out, feces visibly fell from his shorts and down his leg, landing on the canvas in full view of the crowd and the cameras. The arena gasped. One woman in the audience could be heard gagging, saying she was about to throw up. The referee paused, visibly unsure how to proceed, before making the only reasonable decision possible: walk away from the mess. The commentators attempted nervous humor, joking about who would clean the mat, but the reality was unmistakable. A deeply private bodily failure had just been broadcast live. Event promoter Christopher McCorrell Smith later explained the cause in a Facebook post. Earlier that day, Wolford had attended a chili cookout, eating a heavy meal before competing. Under the stress of the choke, the combination of pressure, adrenaline, and digestion caused what Smith described as a colossal explosion. He joked that Wolford instantly lost 15 pounds, but the internet was far less forgiving. The footage went viral within days, racking up over 1 million views. Wolford was quickly nicknamed the Brown Bomber, a label that followed him everywhere. To his credit, Wolford didn't quit. He announced plans to fight again the following month, determined to prove the incident was just a freak accident. But reputations in combat sports are fragile, and once an image like that circulates, it never truly disappears. The fallout went beyond embarrassment. In response to the incident, the Association of Boxing Commissions implemented a new rule, stating that any fighter who releases bodily fluids during a match would forfeit by technical knockout. It was a regulation no one ever expected to write, created solely because this moment had been seen by too many people to ignore. This wasn't a moment of malice. It wasn't cheating. It wasn't violence. It was a human accident, magnified by cameras that refused to cut away. For Wolford, it became a lifelong reminder that in MMA, nothing stays private. And once something airs live, it belongs to the internet forever. Of all the moments that make fans look away, this one stands apart as a scene that never needed to be broadcast in the first place. If bodily failure exposed how unpredictable the human body can be, then Dennis Hallman's wardrobe disaster exposed something even more uncomfortable: a total breakdown of professionalism on the sport's biggest stage. At UFC 133 inches, August 2011, Hallman stepped into the octagon to face Brian Ebersol, and before a single punch was thrown, the crowd already knew something was very wrong. Hallman walked out wearing a pair of tiny blue Speedos, an outfit that looked completely out of place in a modern UFC event. The reaction was instant. Fans groaned. Commentators hesitated. Social media exploded. UFC president Dana White was reportedly furious the moment Hallman appeared on screen. Hallman later claimed he lost a bet with teammates and had to wear the Speedos as punishment, but choosing to honor that bet on a live pay-per-view watched by millions was a decision no one could justify. The fight itself barely mattered. Brian Ebersol dominated from the opening bell and quickly took control. But the real nightmare happened during ground exchanges. As the fighters scrambled, Hallman's Speedos shifted, and the cameras captured a clear wardrobe malfunction. His protective cup, which Dana White later mocked as being the size of a helmet, failed to keep everything contained. The image flashed across screens worldwide, creating one of the most uncomfortable moments ever broadcast by the UFC. Dana White's reaction was immediate and explosive. After the fight, he awarded Ebersol a $70,000 bonus, officially labeled as Submission of the Night, but everyone understood the real reason. White wanted the fight off television as fast as possible. He later erupted at UFC staff, questioning how Hallman was allowed to walk to the cage without being stopped. At the time, state athletic commissions had authority over fighter attire, but no one intervened. That failure embarrassed the promotion. The fallout was swift. Dana White implemented a strict UFC dress code, banning Speedos and similar attire permanently. What had once been tolerated in the early, chaotic days of MMA was no longer acceptable in a global sport trying to maintain legitimacy. Hallman defended himself by pointing out that early UFC fighters wore gis, wrestling tights, and unconventional gear, but the sport had moved on. His choice felt like a relic of an era the UFC was desperate to forget. Hallman went further, accusing fans of being disgusting perverts for replaying the footage frame by frame. But critics argued the opposite. Viewers weren't hunting for a malfunction. It was impossible to miss because the outfit itself was inappropriate for a fight. Ebersol, for his part, handled the situation with humor, joking that he hoped Hallman's equipment wouldn't fail again, and saying the story would make his grandchildren laugh someday. For Hallman, the damage was permanent. The Speedo incident became the defining image of his UFC career, overshadowing everything else he had accomplished. It wasn't violent, it wasn't dangerous, but it humiliated the fighter, the promotion, and the broadcast all at once. It forced policy changes and reminded the UFC that not every moment of raw authenticity deserves to be shown. Some moments don't shock. They simply shouldn't exist on camera at all. If Dennis Hallman's Speedo incident embarrassed the UFC, then BJ Penn versus Joe Stevenson at UFC 80 confronted fans with something far more unsettling. Violence so graphic it crossed into horror. On the 19th of January 2008, in Newcastle, England, the UFC staged a fight meant to crown a new lightweight champion. What unfolded instead became one of the bloodiest scenes ever broadcast live. BJ Penn, already a former UFC welterweight champion, entered the bout chasing history. A win would make him only the second fighter ever to hold UFC titles in 2 weight classes. Joe Stevenson was no pushover. He was tough, durable, and riding a 4-fight win streak. On paper, it was a compelling championship matchup. In reality, it turned into a brutal demonstration of skill disparity. Just 5 seconds into the fight, Penn landed a right uppercut that dropped Stevenson to the canvas. The crowd erupted, sensing a quick finish. Stevenson survived, staggered back to his feet, and tried to recover. Penn stayed composed, methodical, and precise. Then came the moment that changed the tone of the fight forever. With less than 40 seconds left in the first round, Penn sliced an elbow across Stevenson's forehead. The cut opened instantly. Not a trickle, not a bleed. Blood began spraying outward in visible bursts, splashing onto the canvas and into the air. The image was shocking. Commentators fell silent as the camera zoomed in. Between rounds, the cutman worked desperately to slow the bleeding, pressing, wiping, stitching, doing everything possible to keep the fight alive. They succeeded, barely. When the second round began, Penn immediately targeted the wound again. Each punch reopened it. Blood poured down Stevenson's face, blinding him, soaking his chest, and staining the mat. Midway through the round, Penn knocked Stevenson down once more, took his back, and locked in a rear-naked choke. As Penn squeezed, the visual became almost surreal. Blood continued to shoot from Stevenson's forehead while he was being choked, covering Penn's arms, shoulders, and torso. The octagon floor looked less like a sports arena and more like a crime scene. Stevenson finally tapped at 4 minutes and 2 seconds of the second round. The fight was over. The damage was done. Penn was crowned champion, but the victory celebration felt muted. The amount of blood loss was staggering. Stevenson was drenched. Penn was drenched. The canvas was drenched. Replays of the finish made even seasoned fans uncomfortable. Penn later joked that the blood actually helped lubricate his arm during the choke, a dark comment that only emphasized how extreme the scene had been. He admitted he feared the fight might be stopped due to the cut, but he wanted a definitive finish, not a doctor's stoppage. For Stevenson, the loss was brutal but honorable. He showed incredible toughness, surviving far longer than many would have. For the UFC, however, the imagery raised uncomfortable questions. At what point does realism become excess? At what point does broadcasting a fight turn into broadcasting trauma? The moment was replayed endlessly, cementing Penn's legacy, but also serving as one of the clearest examples of MMA's raw violence in its most graphic form. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't embarrassment. It was controlled brutality, and that's precisely why it unsettled so many viewers. BJ Penn versus Joe Stevenson remains one of the most iconic lightweight title fights ever, but it also stands as a reminder that some moments, while legitimate, may have gone too far to be shown in full. Sometimes, the line between sport and spectacle is drawn in blood. Looking back at these moments, it becomes clear that the UFC's greatest strength is also its greatest risk. By refusing to hide anything, the promotion has given fans an unfiltered look at combat in its rawest form. That honesty helped build the sport. It made the UFC feel real in a world full of scripted entertainment. But it also means that when things go wrong, they go wrong in front of millions, and those images never disappear. From bone snapping in slow motion, to post-fight chaos that overshadowed historic victories, to humiliating wardrobe failures and blood loss so extreme it shocked even veteran fans. These moments force the audience to confront an uncomfortable question. Just because something happens inside the cage, does it automatically deserve to be replayed, archived, and turned into promotional material? Or is there a point where protecting the fighter, the sport, and even the viewer should come before clicks and spectacle? For the athletes involved, these clips are not just highlights. They are permanent digital scars. Tim Sylvia is remembered as much for his broken arm as for his championship reign. Dennis Hallman never escaped the shadow of that one wardrobe malfunction. Joe Stevenson's toughness is often reduced to an image of blood spraying across the canvas. These moments follow fighters long after the cheers fade, long after the contracts end, long after the cameras move on. The UFC has evolved. Rules have changed. Uniforms have been redesigned. Medical stoppages are more cautious. But the core tension remains. MMA is violent by nature, and fans tune in because of that intensity. The challenge is knowing where documentation ends and exploitation begins, where history becomes discomfort, where reality turns into something that should have been left unseen. So the question isn't whether these moments happened. They did. The question is whether everything that happens inside the octagon should live forever on screen. And as the sport continues to grow, that may be one of the most important conversations the UFC will ever have. Which of these moments made you look away? And which ones do you think should never have been shown at all?